and work through those concerns one by one. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Moana Mackie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and as my colleague Damien O'Connor has said, we will be supporting this bill. It is perhaps long overdue, and often in this House we find ourselves passing legislation in the wake of a tragedy or an unfortunate event, and of course this bill was brought about because of the loss of 6 lives on a South Korean foreign charter vessel in New Zealand's exclusive economic zone, and that is a tragedy that I'm sure everyone in this House regrets, and it's a shame that far too often we're dealing with issues after the event instead of perhaps with the benefit of hindsight realising that some of these tragedies could be avoided. Because certainly there's no question that there has been a spotlight on the activities and the practices aboard foreign charter vessels for a long time. In recent years in particular, it's become a particular kind of focus of investigative journalism, and I think all New Zealanders will be shocked to have seen many of the stories and the photos and the documentary evidence coming off these vessels of violence, of physical and sexual abuse, of slave labour, things which are absolutely unthinkable in New Zealand but unfortunately have been occurring under our laws and have been occurring on our watch. And so we do welcome this legislation and hope that it will be the beginning of a new era in terms of the treatment of those workers who are on board these foreign charter vessels, and hopefully we won't see those tragedies like that one that we saw of the South Korean vessel with the loss of 6 lives, Mr Speaker. So this bill is an important step forward, and it is that the government is to be praised for the step they've taken, which was to their credit beyond what the inquiry actually called for. The government's decided to go further and require that these vessels be flagged in New Zealand waters, which means that they will be subject to all New Zealand laws, including those of health and safety, whereas before they were only subject to the Minimum Wage Act and to food safety legislation, and then everything else they were subject to the laws in the country in which they had registered or flagged their vessel. And New Zealand, again, is unfortunately, this is not a world-leading kind of movement. We are one of the few countries in the developed world that actually hasn't taken this step already. I think only Namibia and Brazil still allow foreign charter vessels to be flagged in other countries. So this really brings New Zealand into line with where the rest of the world has already moved to. And one of the questions I would have for the Minister, I assume that this will also bring foreign charter vessels into New Zealand taxation laws, so that these vessels will not only be subject to health and safety legislation of New Zealand, employment legislation of New Zealand, environmental legislation of New Zealand, but also to pay the same taxes that New Zealand fishing vessels pay. For example, the carbon charge that's on fuel under the emissions trading scheme. I know it's been difficult for New Zealand vessels that they've been subject to that particular charge, but the foreign charter vessels that they're in direct competition with have not been subject to those same taxations, to excise tax, to GST, to the many other taxes that we have, and so I'm assuming that this legislation in requiring vessels to be flagged in New Zealand waters will also bring those foreign charter vessels under New Zealand taxation legislation, which provides a level playing field with our own operators in New Zealand, of course. I want to pick up on a point that my colleague Damien O'Connor made, because I think it's a really critical one, which is that you can pass all the legislation in the world, but it won't make a blind bit of difference if it's not able to be enforced. And we know how difficult it is to enforce legislation in parts of New Zealand that it's easy to get to, in parts of New Zealand that it's easy to monitor. So when we're talking hundreds of kilometres out in our exclusive economic zone, I think what we're going to want to hear from government at Select Committee is how are they going to be enforcing New Zealand laws aboard these ships? Because if we don't get an answer to that question, then passing this bill won't do anything. And it's that enforcement aspect which will determine whether or not this legislation is successful. And it's not good enough to kind of say, well, we'll see how it goes, or we already have current Department of Labour processes in place, because we're dealing with a very, very different environment, a very, very different set of circumstances when we're talking about fishing vessels in the exclusive economic zone than when we're talking about young workers at McDonald's, for example, and ensuring that they're getting paid the minimum wage, that their health and safety and that their rights are being looked after. So that issue of enforcement and of how we are going to monitor and ensure that this legislation is being adhered to and is being followed is going to be the critical point, I think, at Select Committee for members of the Labour Party. We also have concerns around the ability of the New Zealand fishing vessels to compete with these foreign charter vessels. And I know one of the concerns has been, if you look at the issue around when fishermen are out there fishing their quota and suddenly, for example, there's a native bird caught in a set line, and often the fishery can be shut down. And this happens not infrequently. And it's a real frustration for local fishermen when they come to you and say, you know, every single time this happens, it's not us doing it. We get shut out, our fishery gets shut down, we lose income, we lose the ability to fish our quota because someone out there has not shown the environment the respect they deserve, has not shown the wildlife the respect they deserve, something which our fishing fleet in New Zealand does do, and to their credit they do that. They take their commitment to protecting the wildlife and the environment that they're working in very, very seriously, and the entire ecology of the system, because they're reliant on it for their very income. And so their frustration is that, in their experience, it's always foreign fishing vessels, foreign charter vessels, that are capturing these birds, that are causing these incidents, that are causing the fishery to be shut down, and there is nothing that they can do about it. They do everything right, and then they get punished for the actions of others who are not subject to the same laws, who are not subject to the same conditions as they are. And I really hope that this piece of legislation will start us down a track to rectifying that and to ensuring that the ability of New Zealand fishing operators to carry out their activities does not continue to be hampered by the actions of a few who don't take the protection of New Zealand's wildlife, the protection of our marine environment seriously. So hopefully we'll be able to hear from the New Zealand operators as to whether or not they believe that this legislation goes far enough in ensuring that a level playing field and a fair situation is created for what's left of our domestic fishing fleet. And unfortunately, there's not a lot left of it. And I think, you know, we're seeing the results of, I know the Ministry of Fisheries thinks it's a really great thing that we now just have a lot of really big quota owners instead of a whole lot of little ones, but I think the flip side of that has been what we've seen with these foreign charter vessels, which is that instead of having the families who've done the fishing, who've had that quota, who've passed it on from generation to generation, who care about the environment, who understand and respect the lifestyle, instead we've gone to this very corporate model with, unfortunately, operators who don't show that same level of respect. And it might be efficient for the Ministry of Fisheries to have a few really big quota holders, but I think we've seen the environmental damage of that, and we've seen the impact on the workers in that industry, which would indicate that perhaps that change isn't nearly as efficient or positive as perhaps the Ministry of Fisheries would lead us to believe. We think that there is a missed opportunity in this legislation, and we will be pursuing that at Select Committee, which is we think that there is actually an opportunity here to encourage maximum participation of New Zealand fishing operators within the industry by moving towards a minimum of 50% New Zealand crew on any vessel fishing within New Zealand's exclusive economic zone. We think part of the solution to this problem has to be building up the capability within our own domestic fishing industry, and we don't think that there is anything wrong with the government saying that we want to see a minimum of 50% New Zealand crew on these vessels. And I tell you what else that would do. It would go a long way towards ensuring that that monitoring and enforcement function that I discussed earlier is actually carried out. By having those eyes on board, it means that that's something that perhaps that it removes part of that problem that we discussed earlier around how we make sure that this legislation is actually enforced. So we will be pursuing that at Select Committee because we think we have a real opportunity here. A real opportunity to support New Zealand local fishing industry and to make the implementation of this bill easier. The only other point I would raise is we do think the 4-year transition period is far too long. We think this could be in place within a year, if not 2. 4 years provides a big window of opportunity for more abuse to happen, for more tragedy to occur, and we want to see that time frame, whilst being realistic.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. I call Stephen Browning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to the